An 8-year-old boy found a baby trembling and with peeling skin inside a car. When the paramedic arrived and saw the baby, he burst into tears. Ethan was sitting in his black leather armchair, holding a glass of cognac between his fingers as he watched the night fall over the city. The glow of the lights reflected in his wide windows, but nothing there warmed his cold heart. Ethan was not a kind man. On the contrary, he enjoyed toying with others' fates, as if it were a personal game. He possessed money, power, and influence, but the true fun for him was in manipulating those he considered weak. That's why, as he looked out the window and saw a beggar leaning against a pole, a sadistic idea began to form in his mind. Rising slowly, Ethan adjusted his suit and calmly descended the marble stairs. The sound of his shoes echoed through the lobby, and a slight smile formed on his lips. As he opened the door, the night's chill touched his face, but he didn't care. His gaze fell on the thin man in tattered, dirty clothes, trembling with cold as he clutched an old blanket to his chest. "Hey, you there!" Ethan called out, his voice laden with false generosity. "You're hungry, aren't you? Come in, I have leftover food. Today you'll have a feast." The beggar slowly raised his head, hesitant. His eyes showed doubt and surprise. It had been a long time since anyone offered him anything but contempt. This is serious, sir?" asked the beggar, not believing what he heard. His stomach growled with hunger, and the mere idea of a hot plate made him salivate. "Of course it is. I'm in a good mood today," Ethan replied, smiling calculatingly. "But there's one condition. You have to trust me. Come with me without asking questions." The beggar hesitated for a moment, but hunger spoke louder. He knew that on the street he wouldn't survive much longer without something to eat. So with uncertain steps, he walked to the entrance of the mansion. The luxury left him impressed. He had never been in such a grand place. Ethan guided the beggar to a room and locked him in there, ensuring he would spend hours without leaving. The silence and darkness of the environment increased the man's discomfort as he tried to understand what was happening. On the other side of the door, Ethan merely smiled, satisfied with the result of what he called a test. What is this?" the beggar shouted, pounding on the door in despair. The room was dark, windowless, and only the muffled sound of his own breathing filled the place. "This is a test," Ethan replied from the other side of the door, amused. "If you can endure the entire night locked in here with no light, no sound, nothing, I'll give you food in the morning. But if you can't take it, well, I guess you'll have to leave the way you came in, with nothing." Ethan's cold laughter echoed down the hallway. He slowly walked away, leaving the man trapped in total darkness. The beggar leaned against the door, feeling panic spreading through his chest. His eyes tried to adjust to the darkness, but it was impossible to see anything. "Please, kind sir, I just want to eat. I don't need this," he mumbled, his voice trembling. But he knew begging wouldn't change anything. The man on the other side was cruel. Ethan wanted to see him suffer. Hunger was already gnawing at his stomach, and now fear made his heart race. The idea of spending hours there, not knowing what could happen, was terrifying. The minutes dragged on as if they were hours. The beggar felt his throat dry, cold sweat running down his neck. There was no furniture, no bed, only a cold floor. He sat against the wall, hugging his knees. His body was already weak before, but now despair made him tremble. "I just need to endure until dawn," he repeated to himself, trying to find strength. But the darkness around him seemed alive, swallowing his thoughts, creating imaginary shadows that tormented him. Ethan, on the other hand, slept peacefully in his luxurious bed. To him, all of this was a mere game. A way to test how far a starving man would go for a plate of food. He knew the human mind was fragile, and fear could be worse than hunger. If the beggar screamed, begged, maybe he would even raise the stakes. But if he resisted until the end, it would be interesting to see in what state he would emerge. Ethan loved seeing despair in people. He loved knowing he had absolute power over someone so vulnerable. In the dark room, the beggar began to lose his sense of time. He no longer knew if he was awake or dreaming. The hunger hurt like never before, and the absolute silence made everything even worse. "I can make it. Just a few more hours," he muttered, his voice growing weaker. But the darkness seemed to play with his mind. He began to hear non-existent whispers, feel presences around him. It was fear taking over. His body trembled, his breathing quickened. "I can't. Go insane, he said to himself, trying to cling to any rational thought. When the first light of morning began to seep through a crack under the door, Ethan got up satisfied. He put on his robe, drank his coffee and walked calmly to the room where the beggar was locked up. He wanted to see the result of his little prank. "Good morning," he said, unlocking the door with a smile. "Let's see if you survived the night." Upon opening the door, Ethan found the beggar huddled in the corner, his gaze lost, his eyes red and swollen from not having slept for a second. The man's breathing was irregular, and his body trembled. "Looks like you made it." "Well, maybe I really should give you food now," Ethan said, laughing softly. "But was it worth it?" The beggar didn't answer. He just looked at him with empty eyes, as if he were broken inside. Ethan smiled contentedly. The game had been interesting. Ethan watched the beggar in the corner of the dark room. The man was hunched over, his arms wrapped around his own body, trembling with cold and exhaustion. His eyes could barely focus when the light flooded the room for the first time since the night before. His unkempt beard, pale face, and cracked lips showed how weak he was. He tried to raise his head, blinking repeatedly, trying to get used to the sudden brightness. His body seemed to be made of lead, unable to obey any command. "Please, sir." "The food," the beggar muttered, his voice hoarse and almost inaudible. "I spent the night here as you asked. Please." He tried to get up, but his legs failed him and he fell to his knees. His stomach growled loudly and a cold sweat ran down his forehead. Ethan crossed his arms, smiling sideways, and watched the man's misery with amusement. "You really thought that just spending one night in the dark would get you food? Do you think life is that easy?" he said with disdain. The beggar opened his mouth, but his voice failed. His eyes were watery, and the hope that was left in him seemed to fade away. "You promised. I did what you asked," he mumbled, his breathing heavy. He tried to lean against the wall, seeking strength to keep standing. Ethan sighed, pretending boredom, and took a step forward. "I didn't promise anything. I just said we'd see if you could take it. And look at you, a human rag. Now get out of my house before I throw you out on the street myself." Ethan opened the door and without any explanation pointed to the exit. "You've been here long enough," he said coolly. The beggar hesitated, but realizing he had no choice, he slowly went out onto the street, where the icy wind immediately enveloped him. And without looking back, he went in and slammed the door. Ethan's phone vibrated in his pocket. He took out the device and answered without looking at who it was. "Ethan," Victoria's tearful voice came from the other end of the line. "I'm at the maternity ward. The baby is coming. I need you here now." Ethan rolled his eyes and snorted, irritated. "What do I have to do with that, Victoria? You already knew this day would come, so don't come to me with drama. Figure it out yourself. Hire someone to hold your hand." His voice was cold, devoid of any empathy. "Ethan, please," Victoria pleaded, her voice broken by sobs. "I'm scared. It's our son. I can't do this alone." Ethan sighed impatiently and pressed the phone against his ear. "You think I'm going to drop everything to watch you scream in a delivery room? Spare me, Victoria. Be an adult and deal with it yourself." Without waiting for a response, he hung up and put his phone in his pocket. For him, feelings were a waste of time. When he arrived at the company, Ethan walked through the lobby feeling the cautious glances of the employees. He knew they were all afraid of him, and that amused him. "Mark," he called, pointing to one of the employees who immediately shrank back. "Come here now." Mark approached hesitantly, clutching his badge with trembling hands. "Yes, sir?" Ethan cast a disdainful look at the employee's desk, where there was a framed photo of his family. "What is this?" he asked, picking up the object and looking at the photo of a woman and 2 children. "Did you come here to work or to set up a shrine for your family?" Mark hesitated, swallowing hard. "I'd just like to have them close by, sir." Ethan laughed mockingly and, without warning, threw the framed photo on the floor, shattering the glass. "Pick up all your personal crap and destroy it right now. I want to see you breaking everything." His voice was harsh, unyielding. Mark's eyes filled with tears, but he obeyed. He picked up his own laptop and lifted it with trembling hands. With a lump in his throat, he slammed it against the desk, shattering the screen. He picked up his other belongings and threw them on the floor, stomping on them as his horrified colleagues watched. Ethan crossed his arms, eyeing Mark critically. "I need more efficient people, Mark." You're no longer up to the company's standards." The employee took a deep breath, feeling the weight of those words, but there was nothing that could be done. He simply lowered his head and left the office, while Ethan watched his departure without any remorse. But the day was not over yet. As he went up the stairs, Ethan saw an employee carrying a stack of papers and decided to have a little more fun. He waited until the man passed him and with a strong push knocked him down the stairs. The employee's body hit the steps, the papers flew through the air, and a groan of pain filled the hallway. The other employees looked on in horror, but no one dared to say anything. Ethan merely raised an eyebrow and shrugged. "If you can't even stand up, you're not fit to work here," Ethan said, slowly descending the stairs without even looking at the fallen man. The employee moaned, clutching his sprained ankle, but Ethan walked past him as if he were invisible. He liked to feel absolute power over others, to know that no one dared to confront him. For him, each day was a new opportunity to crush someone, and on that day, he had started early. Later, Ethan entered the hospital unhurriedly, his footsteps echoing coldly through the white antiseptic corridors. The strong smell of disinfectant and medicine bothered him, making him wrinkle his nose slightly. He had never liked that environment. There was something about that place that disgusted him, perhaps the feeling of fragility and suffering that hung in the air. People cried in the corners, nurses rushed back and forth, doctors exchanged serious expressions, and none of it elicited the slightest reaction from him. He was not there of his own free will, but rather because he wanted Victoria to know that he didn't care. He wanted to see her at her happiest and destroy her with his coldness, as he always did. Upon opening the door to the room, he found Victoria sitting on the bed, pale and exhausted, but with a gleam in her eyes that he had not seen in a long time. Her disheveled hair fell over her shoulders, and in her arms she held the newborn baby, wrapped in a blue blanket. Her smile was genuine, full of love and hope. Her eyes shone with emotion as she saw him enter, as if she still believed he would have some positive reaction. "Ethan," she said, her voice weak but full of joy. "Look, our son. Isn't he beautiful?" There was expectation in her voice, as if she was begging for a look of approval. But all she received was an empty, indifferent stare. Ethan crossed his arms and analyzed the scene with boredom. His gaze swept over Victoria's frail figure, then slid to the baby, and he sighed. "It's a baby," he said simply, without any emotion. "All babies are the same." Victoria blinked, surprised by the coldness of his words, and her smile faltered. Her heart tightened, as if an invisible hand was crushing it. She clutched the baby to her chest, trying to find strength in the face of the rejection she had already anticipated, but which still hurt. "He's your son, Ethan," she insisted, her voice lower, almost a whisper. "Our son. I've waited so long for this moment. I thought you'd be happy." Her voice broke on the last word, as if the hope were shattering inside her. Ethan snorted impatiently and looked at the watch on his wrist, completely uninterested. "Happy? Why? For something that happens every day with millions of women around the world. You want me to clap because you gave birth to a human being?" he said, his voice laden with sarcasm and disdain. Victoria felt her face burn, not with anger, but with shame and humiliation. Her eyes welled up, but she refused to cry. "I just wanted you to be here." "To care even a little," she murmured, her voice weak and trembling. "I dreamed we would be a family." Ethan let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Family?" he repeated, shaking his head. "You still believe in that nonsense? Feelings are for the weak, Victoria, and you've always been weak." His voice was sharp as a blade, cutting through any remaining illusion within her. He turned without looking back, already heading for the door. "Finish your recovery soon. You've already spent too much money in this hospital." And with that, he left the room, leaving Victoria in silence, holding the baby, her heart shattered by the contempt of the man she once loved. That night, Victoria remained awake, watching the baby, who slept peacefully in her arms. Her eyes were red and tired, but her mind wouldn't stop. She felt a weight in her chest, a suffocating sense of emptiness. She had given birth alone, without the support of the man who should have been by her side. Her heart was fragile, her soul torn apart. Suddenly, a sharp pain rose in her chest, as if something was squeezing her heart tightly. She tried to breathe deeply, but the air wouldn't come. Her hands were trembling, and cold sweat trickled down her forehead. She tried to reach for the emergency button beside the bed, but her arms were weak, as if her own body was giving up. "Ethan," she whispered, even knowing he wasn't there, even knowing he wouldn't care. Her body began to feel heavy, her breathing failing. The heart monitor beeped, the lights in the room seemed to fade from her blurred vision. The last thing she saw was the innocent little face of the baby, before her body went completely still. Ethan's phone rang in the middle of the night. He was sitting in his leather armchair, sipping an expensive cognac, when he answered without any hurry. On the other side of the line, the doctor's voice sounded hesitant, laden with formality and grief. "Mr. Ethan, we're so sorry, but your wife suffered a heart attack. She passed away tonight." There was silence on the other end of the line. The doctor was waiting for some reaction. Perhaps shock, sadness, a questioning. But Ethan merely exhaled slowly, showing no emotion. "And what do you want me to do about it?" he asked, his voice monotonous, devoid of any feeling. "Sir, we're deeply sorry for your loss, but we need you to come to the hospital to sign some documents," the doctor continued, visibly uncomfortable with the man's coldness. "The baby is fine, but we need to know what to do with your wife's body." Ethan looked out the window, watching the illuminated city full of life, indifferent to Victoria's death. He stood up calmly, stretching his arms before responding. "Send an ambulance to pick it up and take care of it. I don't have time to waste on burials." And without waiting for any protest, he hung up the phone as if that conversation was just another common annoyance. The next morning, while friends and relatives cried at Victoria's funeral, while the baby was held by a nurse trying to comfort him in the midst of his orphanhood, Ethan wasn't there. He didn't attend the burial, didn't say goodbye, didn't shed a tear. To him, Victoria was already part of the past, just another name crossed off his life. After all, feelings were for the weak, and he would never be weak. Ethan never showed any interest in the baby Victoria had left behind. To him, that child was merely an unwanted burden, an annoying consequence of an event that no longer meant anything. He didn't care if the boy cried all night, if he needed to be fed or changed. The sound of the baby's screams echoed through the mansion, but Ethan simply turned up the volume on the television or locked himself in his office, completely ignoring his existence. Taking care of the child was out of the question. He was not a man of affection, nor of responsibilities that didn't bring him direct benefits. But since he couldn't simply discard him without raising suspicions, he made the most practical decision: to pay someone to deal with it for him. That's how Lorraine appeared, a woman just over 50 years old, with skin marked by time and calloused hands from so much hard work. She had brown eyes full of patience and a gentle voice that conveyed serenity. She came from a simple life, without luxuries, and carried in her chest the weight of years of service in rich homes. She desperately needed that job, so she accepted without hesitation when Ethan offered her the position of nanny. However, on the very first day, he made it clear that it wouldn't be just that. "Here, I'm the one who pays, so you do exactly what I tell you to do," Ethan said, his voice as sharp as a cold blade. "Taking care of this brat is just part of your job. I want this house spotless. I don't want to see a single speck of dust, a single object out of place. If I notice you're neglecting your duties, Lorraine, I guarantee you'll regret it." In the first few days, Lorraine dedicated herself completely to the baby. She fed him at the right times, changed his diapers, rocked him in her arms when he cried. She knew that child would never know the love of his own father, so she tried to compensate for the lack of affection somehow. She whispered sweet words as she put him to sleep, held his tiny hands, hummed old songs she had learned from her mother. Every smile, every innocent look the baby gave her, warmed her heart in a way she hadn't felt in years. But at the same time, she felt Ethan's gaze upon her, a cold, evaluating gaze that seemed to weigh each of her movements. He never showed interest in his son, never asked about his well-being. He just watched, waiting for any slip-up, any mistake that could be punished. But Lorraine's work wasn't limited to the baby. Each day, Ethan increased her workload, turning her not only into a nanny, but also a maid, cook, and servant. He left strict orders, demanding that every corner of the mansion be spotless. "I want to see this house shining, Lorraine," he would say with a merciless tone. "If I notice a dusty piece of furniture, a poorly washed floor, a smudged window, I swear you'll regret setting foot here." No matter how tired she was, Lorraine never questioned. She worked all day, cleaning bathrooms, scrubbing floors, polishing furniture. Her back ached, her feet burned, her hands were red from so much contact with cleaning products. But she endured. She endured for the baby because she knew he had no one else to offer him love. A night while finishing cleaning the house, Lorraine realized she had never gone up to the attic. She had cleaned all the other rooms in the mansion, but that space seemed forgotten, untouched. Curious and believing Ethan wouldn't mind, she decided to go up and check it out. The attic was dark and dusty, filled with old boxes and furniture covered in white sheets. The musty smell was strong, and she coughed as she inhaled the dust-laden air. She walked slowly, observing the objects, trying to understand why that place was so neglected. She felt a strange chill down her spine, as if she shouldn't be there, as if that place held something that shouldn't be discovered. It was then that suddenly a dull noise echoed behind her. The attic door slammed shut with a bang, and the metallic sound of the latch being turned froze her blood. Immediately, she ran to the door and tried to turn the knob, but it was locked. Her heart raced and a chill took over her chest. "Mr. Ethan?" she called, her voice trembling. "The door closed by itself. I can't get out. Can you please open it?" But there was no answer, only the frightening silence of the attic. Then she heard footsteps on the other side, and shortly after, Ethan's voice laden with sarcasm and cruelty. "I warned you to do your job and not meddle where you shouldn't," he said, his voice echoing darkly through the wood. "The attic is none of your business, Lorraine. You have no right to be in there, but since you like that place so much, spend the night in there." Panic took over Lorraine. She banged desperately on the door, her hands shaking. "Please, Mr. Ethan, I didn't know. I didn't mean to disobey. Let me out. It's dark in here. I'm afraid of enclosed spaces," she begged, trying to control her quickened breathing. But Ethan merely laughed on the other side, without a shred of compassion. "Maybe this will teach you to respect my limits," he said, the amusement in his voice making everything even more terrifying. "Maybe tomorrow you'll come out of here more obedient." And without another word, he went down the stairs, leaving Lorraine completely alone in the darkness. She felt her whole body tremble, the despair growing with every second. The air inside the attic seemed dense, oppressive, and the absence of light made everything even more frightening. She tried to take deep breaths, to calm down, but her heart was beating too fast. Every creak of the wood made her dread increase. The night would be long. Ethan knew that, and he wanted her to feel every second of terror. The next day, the sun had not yet settled in the sky when Ethan descended the stairs of his mansion, his footsteps echoing through the immaculate hallways. The house was in absolute silence, but he knew that somewhere Lorraine was still locked in the attic, exhausted, with red eyes from crying so much. During the night, her muffled screams asking to be let out had reached his ears, but he didn't care at all. He just poured himself another glass of his cognac, sat comfortably in his armchair, and enjoyed the distant sound of someone else's despair. For him, that was a spectacle, the fear, the pleading, the surrender. Lorraine would learn her lesson in the worst possible way. He, as always, liked to make it clear who was in charge. After having a perfectly served breakfast, for any slip-up from the cook would result in screams and insults, Ethan put on his tailor-made suit, adjusted his tie with precision, and looked at himself in the mirror for a few seconds. His reflection satisfied him. He was the personification of power, of absolute superiority. As he ran his hands through his neatly combed hair, he felt a deep pride in himself. There was no one above him. No one dared to challenge him, and if anyone tried, he would crush any trace of dignity that person still carried. He grabbed his car keys, left without bothering to release Lorraine from the attic, and drove to the city's shopping center, where he had business to take care of before going to the company. The luxury clothing store he frequented was always impeccable, illuminated with golden tones, filled with mannequins displaying the latest trends, and an expensive perfume lingered in the air. He enjoyed that environment. There he felt that only the strong were present. Only those who could afford the absurd prices of the labels had the right to be in that space. It was while he was walking through the store's aisles, absent-mindedly observing the neatly arranged suits, that his eyes fell upon an employee of his company. She was there, with her back to him, examining a delicate dress in her hands. Her fingers gently glided over the fine fabric, and there was a discreet sparkle in her gaze. She was a young woman of simple appearance, modestly dressed, the kind of person who goes unnoticed among the big names of the business world. However, at that moment, She seemed excited about the piece she was holding. Perhaps it was a gift for herself, a small reward for months of hard work. The shy smile on her lips revealed that the dress meant something to her. Ethan paused for a moment and observed her, his mind quickly calculating what he could do with that opportunity. He felt a sadistic pleasure grow within him. He approached slowly, with a soft smile on his lips, like a hunter who doesn't want to startle the prey before the final blow. "What a coincidence to find you here," he said, his voice laden with false kindness. The employee turned around quickly, her eyes widening as she recognized her own boss standing before her. Her face paled, and her hands gripped the dress more firmly. "Mr. Ethan?" she stammered, trying to maintain her composure. "Good morning, sir. I was just looking at some things." There was a nervousness in her voice, as if she knew that being there, buying something for herself, was wrong in his eyes. Ethan smiled, a controlled, almost affectionate smile. "Let me see," he requested, extending his hand gently. His voice was so calm, so inviting, that the young woman couldn't refuse. With a hesitant gesture, she handed him the dress, feeling a small relief at Ethan's sudden interest in the piece. "It's a lovely dress," he said, analyzing the fabric between his fingers, pretending admiration. "It suits you. You deserve something beautiful like this after all your hard work." His voice seemed sincere, and the employee smiled shyly, surprised by the unexpected kindness. "Yes, sir. I thought maybe it could be a gift for myself." "I've never bought something so beautiful before," she confessed, embarrassed, feeling a warmth in her chest at receiving a compliment from him. For an instant, she believed that Ethan was actually being kind. But then, everything collapsed. With a single quick and brutal movement, he grabbed the dress with both hands and tore the fabric from top to bottom. The dull sound of the cloth ripping echoed through the environment, breaking the store's silence like thunder. The employee's face froze in pure shock, her breath failed, and she couldn't process what was happening. In a matter of seconds, the dress she so desired was destroyed before her eyes. Small pieces of fabric fell to the floor like dead leaves, and with them her dignity shattered. Ethan tossed the torn remains on the floor as if they were trash, his cold, merciless eyes fixed on the young woman's dazed expression. His gentle smile had completely vanished, replaced by a cruel and relentless gaze. "You really thought you could wear something like that?" he said, his voice laden with contempt and irony. "Did you really believe that a woman like you could wear something so expensive? You don't belong in that world." The young woman felt her stomach churn. Her heart was beating erratically, and tears threatened to spill from her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Her throat was dry, and a tight knot prevented her from speaking. Ethan took a step forward, leaning in a bit closer, keeping his tone low but sharp as a blade. "People like you should know your place," he continued, each word cutting like a well-aimed blow. "Work, earn your miserable wage, but never ever think you can be like us." Then, without giving her a chance to respond, he turned with the same calmness with which he had arrived and left the store, leaving her there, motionless, paralyzed, holding the torn remains of the dress between trembling fingers. As he walked out, he could feel other people's gazes upon him, but no one dared say anything. Everyone knew who Ethan was. They knew he was a dangerous man who could ruin anyone's life with the snap of a finger. The employee, on the other hand, was still there, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The dress, which had once represented a small joy, was now nothing more than a pile of destroyed threads. But Ethan didn't care. He didn't need to look back to know that he had broken something more than just a piece of fabric. He had destroyed something inside her, and that was exactly what he wanted. Meanwhile, the house was shrouded in a suffocating silence, broken only by the faint sound of the sleeping baby's breathing in the crib. Lorraine remained by the child for long minutes, feeling a restlessness she had never experienced with such intensity before. Her heart was racing, her trembling hands caressed the boy's delicate skin, and every thought that invaded her mind led her to a single destination. She needed to flee from that house. She had spent too much time observing Ethan's coldness, seeing how he treated everyone around him as mere disposable objects. But what worried her most was his complete indifference towards his own son. There was not a drop of love in his gaze when, rarely, he saw him. Lorraine feared that if that child grew up under the dominion of that man, he would end up becoming as cruel and empty as his father. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering courage to make the most important decision of her life. Since she started working at the mansion, she had subjected herself to inhumane orders, accepted humiliations silently, and endured ordeals she never imagined she could bear. But she had never feared as much as she did at that moment. Fleeing meant defying Ethan in an irreversible way. If he found out, he would show no mercy. Her heart pounded hard in her chest as she carefully lifted the baby, feeling the warmth of that small body against hers. There was no turning back. That child needed a better life, away from that oppressive place. With quick but silent movements, Lorraine grabbed a small bag and began to fill it with everything she might need. Clothes, a baby bottle, a warm blanket, and a little money she had secretly saved over the months. It wasn't much, but enough to escape. With each step towards the front door, her entire body trembled. She felt the weight of the decision on her shoulders, the fear tightening her throat like an ever-tightening noose. But the desperation to save that child was greater than any hesitation. Her mind worked at an accelerated pace, planning every detail. Leave without making noise, walk briskly but without drawing attention, reach the bus station, and buy the first ticket to a distant place. She didn't know exactly where to go, but any destination would be better than that one. She stopped in front of the door, took a deep breath, and grasped the handle firmly. She felt like she was about to commit a crime, but she knew that the real criminal was Ethan, a man who didn't deserve to be called a father. The moment she turned the handle, a loud noise interrupted the silence. Lorraine felt a chill, her heart racing. Someone was there, but she didn't know who. Instinct made her hold the baby more firmly, trying to remain calm. She felt her stomach churn. It wasn't Ethan. Whoever was there, it wasn't someone from the house. Before she could react, a figure emerged from the shadows. A tall man dressed in black maintained a rigid posture, blocking the exit. He remained motionless for a moment, observing Lorraine with a cold, evaluating gaze. The baby squirmed in her arms, sensing the woman's nervousness. The silence was oppressive, and Lorraine knew that every second there could define her destiny. She needed to think fast. "Stay where you are," said the man, his voice laden with coldness. He maintained a firm posture, making it clear that he would not hesitate to prevent any unexpected movement. The air escaped Lorraine's lungs in a silent sob, and her vision began to darken at the corners. She felt the weight of the danger and knew that any wrong reaction could be fatal. Lorraine swallowed hard, her trembling lips trying to form some word, but nothing came out. Her heart was beating so hard that she could hear it inside her own skull. She felt the pressure of the arms around the baby increase, as if she could protect him with her presence alone. Her mind screamed desperately for a solution, but all she could think was that this was not the end she had imagined. She was about to flee, about to give that child a new life, and now she saw her hope slipping through her fingers like sand. If the man was there to rob, she would give everything. If he wanted money, let him take it. But if he was there for something worse, if he intended to hurt the baby, Lorraine felt her stomach churn with horror. She couldn't let anything happen to that boy. Her wet, wide-eyed gaze fixed on the object pointed at her, and her mind desperately sought an escape. Her hands were cold with sweat, her body trembled, and the baby, sensing her anguish, began to fuss restlessly. Lorraine knew that any wrong move could be her last. She was facing a man without a face, without a name, without mercy. And in that moment, she realized that the real danger was not just Ethan. The whole world seemed to conspire against her and that child, and if she wanted to survive, she would need to find a way to escape. But how to escape when that thing is pointing at your head? The chill of the thing still seemed to burn Lorraine's skin, even after the thieves disappeared into the darkness. Her entire body was trembling. Her legs were weak as if they were made of cotton, and she only managed to stay upright because she was holding the baby against her chest, protecting him as if her own life depended on it. The boy squirmed restlessly, sensing the tension in her body, and let out muffled little whimpers. Lorraine felt the hot tears streaming down her face, mingling with the cold sweat that covered her skin. Her heart was pounding in her chest so hard it seemed like it would explode at any moment. She didn't know if she was relieved to still be alive, or terrified of what was to come. For endless minutes she stood there motionless, her eyes fixed on the open door as if she expected the thieves to come back to finish what they started. Her mind still couldn't quite process what had happened. They had gone. She had survived. The baby was safe and sound, but at the same time she knew the danger wasn't over yet. The mansion was in a suffocating silence, a kind of quietness that didn't convey peace, but rather an invisible threat. Every shadow cast by the hallway lamp seemed larger, monstrous, and every little noise and the creaking of wood, the wind beating against the windows, made her jump in fright. Everything inside that house seemed colder, scarier, and the feeling that something even worse was about to happen prevented her from breathing properly. Her gaze swept over the debris scattered on the floor. The thieves had ransacked everything, ripped paintings from the walls, overturned furniture, ransacked drawers, knocked over objects as if they were trash. They had left almost nothing behind. Lorraine felt her stomach churn at the sight of the wreckage. She had no way to hide it. When Ethan arrived, he would see everything, and then she swallowed hard, squeezing her eyes shut. She needed to think of something, needed to find a way to defend herself, but her mind was in a panic. She knew Ethan wouldn't believe her. He never believed her. To him, her word was worthless. And Lorraine knew his look of fury, had felt his cruelty up close. She knew she would be crushed like an insect as soon as he saw that mess. The worst part was that she had nowhere to go. If he kicked her out, what would she do? Where would she go with a baby that wasn't hers? Her heart tightened at the thought. She couldn't abandon that boy. He didn't deserve to grow up under the control of a monster like Ethan. But how could she protect him now? The doorknob suddenly turned, and Lorraine almost let out a scream. Time seemed to stop when she heard Ethan's firm footsteps crossing the entrance hall. Her chest tightened, the air got stuck in her throat, and she felt her blood run cold. Every tick of the clock on the wall sounded like thunder inside her head. The silence became oppressive. Ethan remained there, standing in the middle of the room, observing everything. His gaze moved slowly over the overturned furniture, the open drawers, the broken objects scattered on the floor. The fury in his eyes increased with every detail he absorbed, and a muscle in his jaw twitched. Lorraine felt her legs weaken when he turned to face her. Ethan's face was dark, like a storm about to break. His eyes were two icy slits, and his voice, when it finally broke the silence, came low, laden with threat. What the hell happened here? His question was like a blow. Each word was a crushing weight on her shoulders. "Mr. Ethan, please, I can explain." Lorraine's voice came out trembling, almost swallowed by panic. "It was thieves. They broke into the house. They had sharp objects. I couldn't do anything, sir. They took everything, but I protected the baby, I swear." The words came out desperate, jumbled by fear. Ethan tilted his head slightly to the side, a short, humorless laugh escaping his lips. "Ah, how convenient," he muttered, crossing his arms. "I leave, and suddenly my house is robbed? And you, the only person present, didn't see anything? Couldn't stop it." His voice carried a venom that sent a chill down Lorraine's spine. He began to walk slowly around the room, kicking a piece of broken glass with the toe of his shoe. "Sir, I begged them to let me live. They threatened me." "I swear I didn't do anything wrong," Lorraine sobbed, the tears flowing uncontrollably. Ethan stopped in front of her, his expression hard. "You've been in this house for months, and now, just when I'm gone, a robbery happens." He crossed his arms, waiting for an answer. Lorraine swallowed hard. "Sir, please, I protected the baby." Ethan kept his gaze fixed on her. "I hope you're telling the truth, Lorraine. I don't like unpleasant surprises." She nodded her head frantically. I swear on my life that I did nothing. Please, sir, believe me." But Ethan had already made up his mind. His face hardened, and his voice came out like a death sentence. "Enough. Pack your things and get out of this house right now." The shock hit Lorraine like a blade cutting her skin. "Sir, please, I have nowhere to go. That's not my problem." Ethan turned away, crossing his arms, without even looking her in the eye. "I don't tolerate betrayal. You're fired. Now get out of my sight before I regret not calling the police." Lorraine felt her legs lose their strength. Her eyes were red, her breathing uneven, and she knew any plea would be useless. Ethan had no pity, no empathy, nothing inside him but coldness and disdain. He saw her as a disposable problem, something that could be tossed aside without hesitation. And now, she was completely alone. The mansion's door slammed shut behind her, and the impact of the sound made Lorraine shudder, as if a blow had been struck against her own chest. The cold night air hit her face, razor sharp, and a shiver ran through her entire body. She stood still for a moment on the sidewalk, eyes wide, trying to process what had just happened. Everything she had, her only source of livelihood, her only shelter, had been ripped away from her in the blink of an eye. Ethan had discarded her as if she were a worthless piece of trash, as if her months of dedication and sacrifice meant nothing. Her legs were weak, her breathing ragged, and the only thing preventing her from collapsing right there was the baby in her arms. The little one slept, completely oblivious to the tragedy that had just occurred. The round, innocent face was serene, the tiny lashes fluttering softly in deep sleep. Lorraine looked at him with a heavy heart. That boy was not to blame for anything. He did not choose to be born into a loveless home, did not choose to have a monstrous father. He deserved better. But how could she offer him a future when now she herself was lost, without a roof over her head, without a penny in her pocket? The question echoed in her mind like a torturous drum. With hesitant steps, she began to walk along the sidewalk, feeling the cold wind lash her skin. The streets were empty, and each step seemed heavier than the last. Lorraine had nowhere to go. The money she had saved over the months had been taken by the thieves, and now she only had a few coins hidden in her coat pocket. Coins that would barely be enough to buy a loaf of bread. Her stomach growled in protest, but hunger was the least of her problems. She needed to think, needed to find a way out. But every dark alley she passed, every distrustful look she received from strangers, only made her feel even more vulnerable. Never before had she known what absolute despair was. Now it was her only companion. Hours passed as she wandered aimlessly. Her feet were sore, her eyes heavy, and the weight of the baby in her arms was becoming unbearable. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. If she stayed too long in one place, someone would notice she was a woman alone, without protection. Danger was everywhere. She sat for a moment on a park bench, taking deep breaths to calm the knot forming in her throat. The baby woke up, letting out a small grumble before opening her eyes, hungry. Lorraine closed her eyes, feeling helplessness crush her. She had no milk, no money to buy any. She had nothing. When she opened her eyes again, her vision was blurred by the tears she was trying to hold back. She looked at the small handful of coins she held in her hand and sighed. It wasn't enough for a decent meal. But if she was frugal, maybe she could get something to get through the night. With dragging steps, she got up and walked to a corner store, where she bought a loaf of bread and some milk. The smell of the food made her stomach pang with pain. She hadn't eaten anything since morning, and the weakness made her arms tremble. But the baby came first. She sat back down on the park bench, feeding him slowly, watching the silent streets around her. It was then that she noticed a boy sitting near a trash can, his arms crossed over his belly, his knees drawn up to his chest. His skin was dirty, his clothes ragged, and his sunken eyes watched people pass by, hoping someone would take pity. But no one stopped. Lorraine felt a pang in her chest as she saw him. He was so small, so fragile. And in a way she saw herself reflected in him, because now she too was homeless. She too had nowhere to go. She looked at the bread in her hands, then at the boy, and her decision was instant. She got up and walked over to him slowly, kneeling by his side. The boy looked at her with distrust, but said nothing. His scrawny body was tense, as if he was used to being shooed away from everywhere. Lorraine held out the bread to him, her voice coming out low but gentle. "Here, eat. You must be hungry." The boy hesitated for a second, but hunger was stronger. He took the bread with dirty fingers, almost snatching it from her hands, and began to devour it quickly. Lorraine stayed there, watching him eat voraciously, feeling a lump form in her throat. She herself was starving, her stomach aching with weakness, but seeing that boy eat was more important than her own need. "Thank you," the boy mumbled, his mouth still full. It was the first time he had looked directly at her, and Lorraine saw something there. It wasn't just gratitude, it was the same look she carried within herself, the look of someone who knew the pain of abandonment. She smiled even though she felt her strength fading. "I know what it's like to be hungry," she said, her voice choked, "and I know what it's like to have no one to help, but no one should have to go through that." The boy nodded slowly, lowering his eyes. Lorraine sighed, looking up at the dark sky above them. She still didn't know what she would do. She still didn't know how she would survive. But at that moment, just the fact that she had helped someone eased the pain inside her a little, even if it meant that that night she would go to bed hungry. At night, Ethan watched the crib with a cold and impassive expression, his green eyes analyzing the child who slept soundly, with no awareness of what was about to happen. The little one breathed softly, his round face illuminated by the dim light of the lamp beside him. To anyone else, this scene could be a reflection of innocence, of a new life full of possibilities. But to Ethan, that baby was nothing but a mistake, an unwanted burden that needed to be eliminated. He had never wanted to be a father, had never desired to carry the burden of a child that brought him no benefit. And now that Victoria no longer existed, there was no reason to keep that tiny being alive. He took a deep breath, cracked his knuckles as he did when making a final decision, and leaned over the crib, picking up the baby in his arms without any delicacy. The boy squirmed, letting out a small grumble, but didn't fully wake up. Ethan looked at him with disdain, feeling an irritation growing inside him. That tiny, fragile, dependent being. It was pathetic, useless. He didn't want to look at that child and remember Victoria. Remember her weakness, her pleas, her irritating existence. It was time to end this cycle once and for all. "You should have never been born," he murmured, his voice low and laden with indifference. "But I'll fix that mistake now." With the baby in his arms, he walked in firm steps towards the mansion's exit, descending the staircase without hesitation. The corridor was silent. The employees had already left, and the night stretched dark and cold outside. Everything was perfect for what he intended to do. Ethan opened the front door and felt the icy wind hit his face, but he didn't care. He walked to the car, opened the back door and placed the baby in the car seat, firmly securing him with the safety belts. The little one squirmed once more, his tiny eyes blinking slowly, as if sensing the danger around him. But he couldn't react yet. He didn't yet understand that he was about to be abandoned to his own fate. Ethan closed the car door and drove away without looking back. The place was deserted, and the early morning silence made the scene even more somber. The baby, alone in the car, remained motionless, uncomprehending of what was happening. That child's fate lay in the hands of chance. The road stretched ahead like a tunnel of endless darkness, illuminated only by the car's headlights, cutting through the cold, deserted night. Ethan drove unhurriedly, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his hands firm on the steering wheel as the engine purred softly under his command. In the back seat, the baby cried incessantly, its weak, pleading voice mingling with the sound of the tires sliding over the asphalt. But to Ethan it was nothing more than background noise, an irritating and insignificant sound that would soon be silenced. His thoughts were focused solely on the objective ahead, ridding himself of the burden Victoria had left behind, erasing the last evidence of a mistake that should never have existed. He had already gotten rid of the mother. Now it was the child's turn. The night was freezing and the moonless sky made everything even darker and more desolate. The wind howled through the dry trees lining the road, and the surrounding landscape became increasingly hostile, increasingly isolated. Ethan knew exactly where he was going. He had chosen a place where no one would pass, where no one would find what he was about to abandon. The car's GPS had been turned off and the plates removed to avoid any connection to him. Everything was meticulously planned. He was an intelligent, careful man and never left loose ends. If there was something Ethan hated, it was the feeling of being tied to something useless, and that baby was exactly that, a dead weight that needed to be eliminated. After more than an hour driving down increasingly deserted roads, Ethan finally caught sight of the spot he had chosen so carefully. It was a secluded clearing, surrounded by twisted trees and dense vegetation, where the icy wind blew hard and made the dry branches creak like macabre whispers. He slowed down, feeling the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but not out of fear or hesitation. On the contrary, there was a cold, silent pleasure within him, a sickening satisfaction in knowing that he was in absolute control, that he could decide the fate of another human being without anyone being able to stop him. The car jolted to a stop in the middle of the clearing, and Ethan turned off the engine. For a moment, the silence was absolute, broken only by the insistent crying of the baby. He remained seated in the driver's seat, watching the child in the rearview mirror. The little one was squirming in the car seat, its tiny arms flailing in the air, as if begging for a loving touch, for a sign of protection. But Ethan's eyes were icy, empty, without a trace of compassion. The baby was merely an obstacle to be removed, nothing more. With an impatient sigh, Ethan unlocked his seatbelt and opened the car door, feeling the biting early morning wind hit his face. The night seemed even colder in that God-forsaken place. He walked around the vehicle, moving calmly, unhurried, like someone who knows exactly what they're doing. When he opened the rear door, the baby's crying intensified, as if its instinct knew of the imminent danger. The little eyes were wide open, shining under the dim light inside the car, and the mouth trembled from so much sobbing. But to Ethan, it was nothing more than an irritating sound that would soon cease to exist. He leaned in slightly, undid the buckle of the car seat, and spent a few seconds just watching the defenseless child. His hands worked quickly, adjusting the straps to ensure the baby would be completely immobilized inside the car. But instead of taking it out of there, as someone with a shred of humanity would do, he merely checked that all the doors were locked, that there was no possibility of escape. The baby was trapped, alone in a confined space, condemned to a fate it couldn't even comprehend. Ethan slammed the door shut, the sound of the automatic lock echoing in the silent night. He stepped back a few paces, crossing his arms and analyzing the scene in front of him, his eyes assessing the abandoned car as if he were finishing a routine job. The baby was still crying, but now its screams were weaker, taken over by exhaustion and the cold that was beginning to seep into the vehicle. The air was becoming increasingly thin inside the closed car, and Ethan knew it wouldn't be long before the child's frail body began to succumb. He looked at his wristwatch, mentally marking how long it would take for the crying to stop completely. He wasn't in a hurry. He knew the early morning would do its job for him. The cold would seep through the cracks of the car, hunger would corrode the helpless little body, and the darkness would bring oblivion. No one would find that baby. No one would care. For Ethan, it was just another problem solved, an insignificant detail erased from his life without leaving a trace. With one last indifferent look, Ethan walked over to the brand-new, luxurious car he had parked a few meters away, a model with no connection to the vehicle that would now be left behind. He got in, settled into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The headlights briefly illuminated the deserted road, and he took a deep breath before accelerating, leaving behind the scene of his crime without a shred of remorse. The abandoned car remained there, motionless, surrounded by the darkness and the icy early morning wind. Inside it, the baby's crying continued, growing weaker and more distant with each passing moment. And then, little by little, the silence took over the night, swallowing everything. The next day, Daniel, a poor, homeless boy, walked the deserted streets, his bare feet touching the cold asphalt of the early morning. The boy was used to solitude, the biting wind that scourged his skin, and the sound of his own breathing as his only company. He had learned to survive without expecting anything from anyone, without depending on anything but his own strength. But that night, something different caught his attention. In the midst of the absolute silence, he heard a muffled sound, almost imperceptible, like a faint sob mingling with the wind. Daniel frowned, stopping in the middle of the dark road, his ears attuned to the strange noise. What could it be? An animal? Someone injured? His heart raced slightly, and he followed the sound with hesitant steps, his stomach tight with an unfamiliar feeling. At every step, the crying became clearer, still muffled, but now recognizable. It was a baby. Daniel's eyes widened, feeling a shiver run down his spine. He quickened his pace, running through the shadows of the night until he spotted an abandoned car in the middle of the wasteland. The headlights were off, the windows closed, and no one was around, but the crying came from there, trapped inside the vehicle like a silent scream calling for help. Daniel's heart raced and he ran to the car, his dirty hands pressing against the glass as he tried to see inside. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, and that's when he saw it. In the back seat, a tiny baby was strapped into the car seat, its face red from crying so much, its little arms moving in despair. The child seemed exhausted, its strength fading with every minute. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. Who would have abandoned a baby like that? Who would be cruel enough to leave such a fragile being locked up to die? His breathing quickened, and his instincts screamed within him. He needed to get that child out of there. He couldn't let it die. But at the moment he was about to try to open the door, something made his blood run cold. Daniel felt his heart racing as he saw something moving on the car's window. A small shadow was crawling slowly, getting closer and closer to the baby. He knew he had to act fast before that became a real danger. The boy swallowed hard, his heart beating even harder. He couldn't simply ignore it. If he tried to open the door carelessly, the spider could fall on the baby, and all would be lost. With his eyes fixed on the arachnid, Daniel tried to open the car door carefully, his small, weak fingers pulling the handle with all his might. But it was no use. The vehicle was locked. He tried again, pulling harder, feeling his muscles ache from the effort, but nothing happened. The car was too sturdy for someone like him. Feeling despair rise in his throat, he looked around, searching for something to break the glass. But there was nothing but small stones and dry dirt. There were no wooden pieces, no iron bars, nothing that could be used as a tool. Daniel felt despair taking over his chest. The baby was still crying, but the sound was getting weaker, as if the child was losing strength. He couldn't fail. He had to act fast. He took a deep breath, stepped back, and raised his foot, kicking the door with all his might. The impact made the car sway slightly, but the door didn't give in. He tried again, this time using both hands to hold the vehicle and apply more force to the kick. Nothing. The metal was too strong, and he was small, too weak to cause any significant damage. Sweat ran down Daniel's forehead, and his breathing was accelerated. He looked at the baby, at the spider, at the unbreakable door, and felt a tight knot in his throat. He needed help. But where would he find someone at this hour of the night? Screaming for help would be useless, but he had no other choice. He took a deep breath and let out the loudest scream he could. "Someone help me, there's a baby in here." The night returned only silence. The wind howled, the tree branches swayed, but no one appeared. Daniel felt despair growing inside him, his chest burning from the lack of answers. His gaze returned to the spider, which was now moving slowly across the glass, getting closer and closer to the baby. Time was running out. He needed to do something. He needed to act before it was too late. With clenched fists, Daniel took a deep breath and made a decision. If no one showed up, he would have to keep trying on his own. It didn't matter if he had to break his foot bones kicking that car. It didn't matter if the spider tried to attack him. He wouldn't let that baby die there, alone, in that metal prison, in the middle of nowhere. He prepared to try again, gathering all his strength. But then, in the midst of the darkness, a distant headlight lit up the road. Daniel turned quickly, his eyes wide open. Someone was coming. Maybe it was his only chance to save the baby. He had to act fast. He had to make that person stop. With his heart pounding and hope igniting like a spark inside him, Daniel ran into the middle of the road, raising his arms and shouting with all his might. "Stop! Please! There's a baby trapped here!" The car kept approaching, its headlights illuminating his small, fragile silhouette in the middle of the dark road. But would it stop in time? Would the person inside the vehicle hear his cry for help? Or was he alone in this struggle, doomed to keep trying to save the baby with his own hands until it was too late? Time was running out, and Daniel knew that night was far from over. However, the car drove away without helping. Meanwhile, Lorraine wandered aimlessly through the deserted streets, her bare feet touching the cold asphalt of the early morning. Her eyes were tired, her breathing labored, and each step seemed to weigh a ton. Ever since Ethan had kicked her out of the mansion, her life had become a succession of misfortunes. She had nowhere to go, no food, no one to lend her a hand. The only thing keeping her on her feet was the instinct for survival, the need to keep going even without knowing if there would be a tomorrow. The cold wind whipped her face, and the silence of the night made her chest tighten with loneliness. Then suddenly a strange sound broke the calm of the early morning. A scream, a cry for help. She stopped immediately, her heart racing. She looked around, trying to identify where that voice was coming from. At first, everything seemed too quiet, only the wind whistling through the dry trees. But then, once again, the scream cut through the air. It was the voice of a boy, filled with despair. The panic in his tone was evident. Lorraine felt a chill run down her spine, her body reacting even before her mind could process what was happening. Without hesitating, she started running, her feet moving as fast as they could. If someone needed help, she couldn't ignore it. With every step she took, the feeling of urgency increased. Fear and adrenaline mingled in her chest as she crossed the dark field, guided only by the sound of despair echoing in the night. Finally, her eyes caught the silhouette of a small boy, frantically kicking and pulling at the door of an abandoned car. His slender body trembled with effort, and his voice was choked with desperation. As Lorraine approached, she recognized Daniel, the same boy she had helped hours earlier. The scene before her was chaotic. He was trying to open the door with all his might, but the vehicle was locked. "Daniel!" Lorraine called, her voice laced with concern. The boy turned quickly, his face covered in sweat and tears. His gaze was one of pure panic, and he kept pointing inside the car without stopping pulling on the handle. "There's a baby in here!" he shouted, his breath ragged. "I tried to open it, but it's locked. He's crying a lot. I think he's going to die if we don't do anything." Lorraine's heart raced, and her stomach twisted into a tight knot. Without wasting time, she ran to the car, pressing her dirty hands against the glass as she tried to see inside the vehicle. But as soon as her eyes focused on the tiny body strapped into the car seat, her world shattered. Her blood ran cold in her veins and her legs grew weak. He was Ethan's son. Her heart clenched brutally, and for a moment she felt she couldn't breathe. The little one sobbed, his little face red, his little arms moving weakly in the air. Despair was evident in every detail of that fragile body. The shock was like a blade cutting her skin. How could Ethan have done this? How could anyone have the courage to abandon their own son, to die inside a locked car in the middle of nowhere? Horror took hold of Lorraine, but she couldn't allow herself to freeze. She needed to act. She pulled the handle hard, but as Daniel had said, the door didn't give in. "Damn it," she muttered, despair growing in her voice. "We have to get him out of here now." Her eyes searched for a solution, anything that could be used to break the glass. But then she noticed something that made her breath catch. A giant spider was crawling on the window of the door. The panic was instantaneous. Lorraine recognized the arachnid immediately. It was venomous, deadly. Her hair stood on end when she saw the long legs move slowly, gliding over the glass with frightening precision. If that spider fell on the baby, a single bite could be fatal. Her heart was beating so hard it seemed to want to leap from her chest. She needed to act fast, but she also needed to be careful. "Daniel, step back," she ordered, without taking her eyes off the threatening creature. The boy obeyed immediately, stepping back a few steps, but his expression showed that he too knew that time was running out. The baby couldn't wait any longer. Without a second thought, Lorraine clenched her fists and made a decision. She took a deep breath, fixed her gaze on the glass, and raised her right fist. Her whole body braced for impact. With a grunt of effort, she struck a violent blow against the window. Pain exploded in her knuckles and a crack echoed in the silence of dawn. But the glass only cracked. The baby cried out in fright, and Lorraine felt her chest burn with frustration. She couldn't fail now. She stepped back, repositioned herself, and struck another blow, this time with more force. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, shards flying in all directions. Without hesitation, she thrust her arm through the opening, feeling the shards cut her skin as she pulled the baby out. But before she could hold him completely, something terrible happened. The spider fell on her arm. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. The sharp fangs sank into her skin like red-hot blades, and Lorraine felt the venom spread like a fire inside her veins. Her body reacted with a violent spasm, and a scream of pain escaped her throat. It was a suffocating sensation, a burning that seemed to want to tear her flesh from the inside. Her vision darkened for a second, and her balance faltered. Lorraine's body was weak, her breathing irregular. She felt the strength escaping from her limbs as the spider's bite had an unexpected impact on her body. Every attempt to move her lips to speak was futile. Her body no longer obeyed her. The only thing she could still feel was the weight of her own agony, and the distant sound of the baby's weak crying, echoing like a desperate reminder that she couldn't give up. Daniel looked at her with wide eyes, his heart beating so fast it seemed to want to escape from his chest. He had never felt such great fear in his life. He felt small, insignificant in the face of that situation. How could he save Lorraine? What could he do to prevent her from dying there before him? His gaze fell on the woman's trembling hand, where the cell phone was slowly slipping from her weak fingers. Without thinking, he knelt beside her and took the device, feeling his own sweat wet the screen as he tried to unlock it. He didn't quite understand how those devices worked, but he knew he needed to find a way to call for help. His fingers pressed the emergency numbers hastily, almost missing them in his anxiety. When he brought the phone to his ear, he felt the air leave his lungs. The dial tone rang once, twice, until finally a firm, steady voice answered on the other end. "Emergency service, what is your emergency?" asked the operator, his voice professional but laden with urgency. Daniel swallowed hard, trying to stay calm, but his words tumbled out in desperation. "There's a woman here. She was bitten by a giant spider. She's on the ground, can't speak properly, and it looks like she's going to die. And there's a baby here too. He was trapped inside a car. He's very weak. We need help now, please, come quickly." His voice broke at the end of the sentence, and he squeezed his eyes shut to hold back tears. "Stay calm, boy. I need you to tell me where you are," said the operator, his voice calmer than Daniel expected. "Is there a street, any landmark nearby?" Daniel looked around, trying to see any sign or building, but they were in the middle of a dark wasteland, surrounded by trees and dry bushes. I don't know. We're near a deserted road. There's an abandoned car here, and it's all very dark. Please just come soon." "Understood. We're tracing the call signal. An ambulance has been dispatched. Stay with the woman and keep safe, all right? We'll get there as fast as we can," the operator assured. The boy nodded frantically, even though he knew the person on the other end of the line couldn't see him. He hung up the phone and looked at Lorraine, who was now breathing even more difficultly. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, and her eyes were half open, as if she were fighting against unconsciousness. Daniel held her cold hand and squeezed it tightly, trying somehow to convey a bit of hope. "Lorraine, they're coming. Hold on, please." "You need to be okay." His voice came out laden with fear, but also with a determination he didn't know he possessed. Time seemed to drag on in slow motion. Each second without the ambulance arriving felt like an invisible blow to Daniel's chest. The baby was still sobbing from cold and fear, wrapped in the makeshift blanket, but now quieter, exhausted by what he had been through. The boy felt the weight of despair growing inside him, but then a distant sound made his eyes widen. The sirens cut through the night like a call of hope. The red and blue lights flashed in the distance, rapidly approaching until, in a few seconds, the ambulance braked sharply next to them. The rear door opened immediately, and 3 paramedics came running out, carrying equipment and a stretcher. "We have a spider bite victim," announced one of the paramedics as he knelt beside Lorraine, quickly checking her vital signs. "Weak pulse, signs of paralysis. We need the antidote now." Another professional drew a syringe and injected a transparent liquid into Lorraine's arm. She let out a weak moan, her body contracting slightly as she received the medication. One of the paramedics checked her breathing, while another adjusted an oxygen mask on her face. Daniel watched everything, his body still trembling from the shock of the moment. One of the paramedics finally noticed the baby and frowned. "Kid, where did this child come from?" he asked, pointing to the little one in Daniel's arms. He was trapped inside that car. The door was locked, and there was a spider in there. Lorraine broke the window to save him, but the spider bit her," Daniel explained, gesturing towards the abandoned vehicle. The paramedics exchanged worried looks. One of them grabbed a flashlight and approached the car, illuminating the interior. His eyes widened as he saw the venomous spider still moving on the seat. "Damn, this thing is still alive!" one of the professionals exclaimed. "We can't grab the baby just yet. We need to get rid of this bug first," said another. He grabbed a long stick and slammed it hard against the broken window, trying to drive the spider away. With a quick and precise blow, he managed to fling it away. Another paramedic crushed the insect with a heavy boot, ensuring the danger was eliminated. Now safe, the paramedics prepared to retrieve the baby with utmost care. One of the professionals used a special tool to open the car door without causing further damage. As soon as they managed to unlock the door completely, one of the medics entered and gently picked up the child, wrapping it in a thermal blanket. The baby whimpered softly but was now safe. Daniel watched everything with teary eyes. Finally, the baby was safe. Lorraine was receiving treatment, but the scene still seemed surreal. It was hard to believe all of this had happened in such a short time. One of the paramedics placed a hand on his shoulder and smiled. "You were very brave, kid. If it weren't for you, this baby and that woman wouldn't have survived." Daniel felt a lump in his throat, unsure of what to say. He simply nodded, feeling an immense relief filling his chest. As he watched Lorraine being placed on the stretcher and the baby securely held in the paramedic's arms, he realized that for the first time in a long while, he had done something truly important. and that was all that mattered. The paramedics worked swiftly but precisely as Lorraine was carefully placed onto the stretcher. Her body was still shaking from the spider's venom, and even after receiving the emergency antidote, her breathing was unstable. Her eyes blinked slowly, and her skin was pale and cold, as if life itself was trying to escape her body. But Daniel knew she was still fighting. He watched in silence, his heart aching to see her in that condition. His fear that she might not make it grew like an ever-expanding shadow. It was then that one of the paramedics approached with the baby in his arms. But something was wrong. The little one wasn't crying anymore. He wasn't moving. His face was pale, and his little arms, once so restless, were now completely motionless. Daniel's eyes widened, and he felt his stomach churn. Is he okay?" His voice came out weak, almost inaudible, as he looked at the paramedic holding the child. The professional frowned and quickly checked the baby's vital signs. "He's unconscious. Probably due to the extreme cold and lack of oxygen inside the car," he explained, his tone serious but not desperate. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately for further examination." Without wasting any time, the paramedics entered the ambulance, positioning Lorraine next to the baby, connecting oxygen tubes to both of them. The engine roared to life, and the red and blue lights started flashing again, preparing to depart. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He couldn't let them go alone. He needed to know what would happen to Lorraine and the baby. He ran to the back door of the ambulance and held onto the side firmly, looking at one of the paramedics with pleading eyes. "Please take me with you. I need to know if they'll be okay. I helped save the baby. I was with Lorraine when she got bitten." His words came out rushed, desperate. He didn't want to be left behind. The paramedic sighed, his expression gentle but firm. "Kid, I know you want to help, but we can't take you. Only immediate family members can accompany. We need to rush to the hospital now. You can go there later, okay?" Daniel felt a lump in his throat. His urge was to scream, to plead again, but he knew it would be useless. The paramedics were just following the rules. His body trembled with frustration as the back doors of the ambulance were closed, and the vehicle sped off quickly down the road. The boy remained there, standing in the middle of the dark street, feeling utterly alone once again. The silence of the night seemed even crueler now. His stomach growled loudly, and he realized he hadn't eaten anything for hours. The hunger was unbearable, a sharp pain throbbing within him. His body was weak, his muscles aching, and the early morning chill seemed even more biting. But he couldn't afford to rest. He needed to find food. He needed strength to make it to the hospital and find out what happened to Lorraine and the baby. Daniel started walking through the city, his bare feet touching the cold ground, each step more dragging than the previous one. His gaze wandered the lit streets, where people hurried by, well-dressed, secure in their own routines. No one looked at him. No one cared. Finally, he spotted a small snack bar on the corner, where people ate hamburgers and drank sodas. Hunger tightened even more, and he took a deep breath, gathering courage to ask for something. He approached the counter hesitantly, his dirty hands holding the hem of his tattered shirt. "Please, sir, I just wanted a piece of bread. Anything. I'm very hungry. I just need something to eat," he said, his voice low but full of hope. The attendant, a fat, tired-faced man, threw him a look of disdain and snorted. "This ain't no shelter for beggars, kid. If you don't have money, get lost," he said, banging the spatula on the hot grill. Daniel felt his face burn with shame. He looked around, hoping someone would intercede for him, but all he received were suspicious looks or total ignorance. A woman eating there wrinkled her nose and whispered to the man beside her, "Those street kids always make up stories to get something for free. I bet he's a thief." The boy felt his eyes water, but he refused to cry. He clenched his fists and tried again. "Sir, I can wash dishes, I can sweep the floor, anything. I just need to eat a little. I promise I'll work." The response was a cruel laugh. The attendant grabbed a soda glass and poured it on the floor right in front of him. "Are you thirsty? Then drink from there, brat," he mocked. Daniel felt the humiliation crush him like an unbearable weight. His stomach ached even more and his throat was dry. With burning eyes, he took a step back, feeling smaller than ever. His hope was crumbling little by little. He just wanted to know if Lorraine was okay, if the baby had survived. But instead, all he received was contempt. Daniel stumbled and fell to the ground as a shadow approached. Looking up, he recognized the cold and cruel figure of Ethan, who looked at him with sheer contempt. "What do you think you're doing, huh, kid?" he asked, crossing his arms with an arrogant smile. "What do you think you're doing, huh, kid?" Ethan continued, crossing his arms, his voice laced with venom. "Do you think life is good, huh?" Daniel still felt the impact of the kick in his back as he tried to catch his breath. The cold pavement seemed worse now, as if all the humiliation he had just suffered had a real weight on his body. The well-dressed, cruel-looking man who had attacked him simply turned and went on his way, as if Daniel was nothing more than a disposable object in his path. There was no reason for it. The man didn't know him, didn't know who he was, but still, he made sure to humiliate him. Daniel felt anger rise in his throat, but it soon dissipated, replaced by the feeling of helplessness that had always accompanied him. It didn't matter. He couldn't waste time on that. His goal was different. He needed to find the hospital where Lorraine and the baby were. He needed to know if they would be okay. Even with his body aching, he slowly got up, leaning against the wall beside him. His eyes scanned the street, trying to find a clue as to where the nearest hospital was. He didn't know the names of the streets, but he remembered that the ambulances had headed in a specific direction. He took a deep breath and started walking, ignoring the hunger, pain, and fatigue. Each step was an effort, but he wouldn't give up. The street seemed emptier and emptier, and the silence of the early morning made everything even heavier. After a long time wandering, he finally saw an illuminated building in the distance, with a large red cross shining at the top. His heart raced. That could only be the hospital. Daniel forced his tired legs to move faster until he reached the entrance of the building. As he approached the automatic doors, he hesitated for a moment, feeling a lump in his throat. What if Lorraine wasn't okay? What if the baby? Shaking his head, he pushed the bad thoughts away and entered. The strong smell of medicine and cleaning products filled his nostrils, and he blinked a few times to adjust to the artificial lighting. The hospital was larger than he imagined, and he didn't know where to go, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. "Mister," he called, approaching the reception, where a man in a lab coat was typing on the computer. "Do you know where a woman who was bitten by a spider is? She came with a baby that was stuck in a car. I need to see them." The man raised an eyebrow, looking the boy up and down. Daniel knew he was dirty, with torn clothes and a face marked by fatigue, but he didn't care. He just wanted answers. The staff member took a moment, but then seemed to remember. "Yes, I think I know who you're talking about. They're on the 3rd floor intensive care ward." Daniel quickly thanked him and ran down the hall, hurrying up the stairs. His feet hurt, his lungs burned, but he didn't stop until he reached the indicated floor. As soon as he opened the door to the ward, his eyes scanned the rooms until he finally found Lorraine. She was sitting on a hospital bed, an IV connected to her arm and her hand heavily bandaged. Her face was pale, and her eyes were tired but still alive. When she saw Daniel enter, a small smile appeared on her lips. "Daniel, you came," she murmured, her voice weak but relieved. The boy ran to her, feeling a weight lift off his back. "I thought I'd never find you. I tried to come in the ambulance, but they wouldn't let me. Are you okay? Was the spider really bad?" Lorraine sighed, looking at her bandaged hand. "It hurts a little, but the doctors said I was lucky. They managed to give the antidote in time. If I had waited any longer, it could have been worse." She raised her eyes to Daniel, her expression turning serious. "But it's not me that worries me the most now." Daniel felt his stomach churn. "The baby?" he asked, feeling fear rise in his throat. Lorraine nodded, her eyes full of concern. "The doctors are running tests. The cold, the lack of oxygen, all of that could have caused damage. He hasn't woken up yet. And if he doesn't wake up soon..." Her voice trailed off and she looked away, clutching her hands on the sheet. Daniel's heart clenched as if it were being crushed by an invisible fist. He looked at the closed door at the end of the corridor, where he imagined the baby was being treated. The idea that everything they had done could have been in vain was unbearable. He's going to survive, right? His voice came out almost as a whisper, filled with a fear he didn't want to admit. Lorraine didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were full of worry, and that was worse than any word she could say. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked at Daniel with a firm gaze. "We have to wait, but I'm not leaving until I know he's okay." Daniel swallowed hard and nodded, pulling up a chair to sit beside her. He wouldn't leave either. Not until he knew the fate of that little life that now seemed to depend only on time. And then the long wait began. The hospital felt suffocating. Every noise, every hurried step of the doctors in the hallway seemed to echo inside Lorraine and Daniel's heads. Time seemed to drag, turning seconds into eternities. Lorraine clutched her bandaged hands to her chest, feeling the weight of fear grow inside her. Daniel bit his lip, nervously bouncing his leg. Neither of them dared to speak, fearing that any word would break the fragile thread of hope that still kept them standing. The silence of waiting was a torment, a torture that only increased the anguish. The room door opened slowly, and the doctor entered with a grave demeanor. The way he walked, his rigid posture, already announced that the news was not good. Lorraine felt her heart sink, her breathing became heavy, and Daniel jumped up in a start. The doctor sighed before speaking, carefully choosing his words. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low and serious. "We did everything we could, but the baby didn't make it." Those words cut through the air like a sharp blade, destroying any hope. Lorraine couldn't hold back the sob that escaped her throat, and tears streamed uncontrollably. Her whole body shook, and she covered her face, unable to accept what she had just heard. Daniel was paralyzed, feeling an overwhelming emptiness grow inside him. How could this be real? They had fought so hard, suffered so much, only for the baby to simply disappear. His chest ached, and he closed his eyes, trying to hold back the tears. But it was useless. The pain was too great, too unfair. "No, it can't be," Lorraine murmured between sobs, her face red from crying so much. "He was just a baby. He deserved to live. He deserved a chance." Her body trembled, and she felt as if everything inside her was crumbling. Daniel lowered his head, trying to find the strength to accept reality. The weight of the loss was suffocating, a pain that burned in his chest and seemed endless. The doctor's silence only reinforced the tragedy. It was then that suddenly the door burst open, and one of the nurses rushed in. His expression was agitated, and his breathing was panting, as if he had run. Everyone in the room looked at him, surprised by the interruption. "Doctor!" exclaimed the nurse, trying to catch his breath. "The heartbeats are back. The baby is alive." The shock was immediate, and Lorraine's eyes widened, feeling a chill run down her spine. Daniel blinked several times, unable to believe what he had just heard. The doctor frowned, confused, his gaze alternating between the nurse and the medical records he held in his hands. His lips tightened for a moment, as if he were trying to find some rational explanation for what he had just heard. "What?" he asked, taking a step forward, his voice laden with disbelief and surprise. "How so? The baby had died. I myself checked the vital signs. There were no more heartbeats, no more lung activity." His eyes showed the internal struggle between science and what was being said. It was impossible, and yet it was real. The nurse shook his head, his voice still trembling with emotion, as if he himself still couldn't believe what he had witnessed. "I can't explain it, doctor. We were preparing the body, covering it with the sheet, when the monitor suddenly started beeping. At first we thought it was an equipment error, but then we saw the numbers going up. His heart started beating again, on its own. His lungs started moving. He's breathing on his own. None of the doctors present could understand how, but it happened. It was as if something brought him back. His breathing was panting, and his eyes still shone with the impact of what had happened. The room fell into absolute silence. For a few seconds, no one knew what to say. The weight of the words hung over everyone like an almost impossible truth to accept. Lorraine felt the world around her spin. The tears fell even harder, but this time they were tears of relief. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, and her hand trembled as she covered her mouth. Her heart pounded frantically, a mixture of disbelief and hope assailing her entire body. "My God! He came back," she whispered. Her voice choked, as if she were afraid that by saying it out loud the miracle might unravel. Daniel felt a lump in his throat, his breathing faltering for a second. His heart was beating so fast that he could hear it inside his own head. He wanted to believe, wanted to be sure it was true, that it wasn't some kind of cruel mistake. "So, he's alive?" he asked, his voice laden with hope, trembling slightly as if he were afraid the answer would be negative. His eyes shone, and his whole body seemed to gain new energy. He had held that baby in his arms, had felt the coldness of his skin, had heard the doctors decree his end, and now suddenly, he was back. The doctor still seemed incredulous, as if his mind were processing it all slowly. He ran his hands over his face, took a deep breath, and finally managed a small smile. "Yeah, he's alive," he confirmed, slowly shaking his head, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and admiration. "This is a true miracle. There is no other explanation." His eyes shone with silent respect for something that went beyond medicine, beyond the logic he knew. Lorraine let out a laugh between tears, feeling her heart explode with gratitude. Her body was still trembling, but this time it was from a different emotion. She pressed her hands against her chest, closed her eyes for a moment, and silently thanked whatever force had brought that little being back to life. Daniel raised his arms and ran his hands over his face, laughing nervously, as if he still couldn't fully believe what had just happened. After so much pain, so much fear, so much uncertainty, fate had given them a second chance. The nurse smiled as he saw their reaction and continued with a calmer voice but still laden with emotion. "We're monitoring him closely, but the signs are good. The heartbeats are stable and his breathing is returning to a normal rhythm. If everything continues like this, he can make a full recovery. We still need to observe him, but this was something I've never seen before." He shook his head, as if he were still trying to accept the magnitude of the moment he had just witnessed. Lorraine closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the tension in her body begin to slowly unravel. Her heart was still beating rapidly, but this time it wasn't out of fear but out of gratitude. That baby was strong, a true warrior. He fought against death and won. It wasn't just a miracle, it was a rebirth. Daniel looked at her and smiled, quickly wiping his eyes. For the first time in a long time, they had a real reason to believe in the impossible. Life had given that baby a new chance, and they would never let it be in vain. The hospital now seemed a very different place from what it was hours ago. The once stifling environment, charged with tension and despair, now brought a sense of calm. The baby was alive. Not just alive, but well. He breathed softly, his tiny chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. He was sleeping, protected in the hospital crib, surrounded by monitors that now only confirmed that everything was under control. Lorraine watched him with tear-filled eyes, still not fully believing that this miracle had actually happened. Her heart warmed to see him there, fragile yet strong, as if reborn. Daniel, sitting beside her, also couldn't stop looking at the baby. He was still trying to process everything that had happened that night. It was as if the world had spun too fast, and he was still trying to find his balance. But despite the relief and happiness of seeing the baby well, there was still something that bothered him, something he couldn't ignore. Taking a deep breath, he turned to Lorraine, his expression becoming serious. "Lorraine, there's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice hesitant. Lorraine looked away from the baby and frowned, sensing the boy's different tone. "What is it, Daniel?" He lowered his head slightly and ran his hands over his knee, nervous. "When I was coming here before reaching the hospital, a man kicked me on the street, for no reason at all. I was just walking and he appeared out of nowhere, looked at me with disdain and knocked me to the ground. He called me a street rat and laughed at me as if I was nothing." He paused for a moment, remembering the pain, the humiliation, the coldness in that man's voice. He was well-dressed, strong, looked like someone important, dark hair, serious face, a cruel look. Lorraine's eyes widened and her body went rigid. The shock crossed her face like a wave, and for an instant it seemed like her heart had stopped beating. "What did he look like exactly, Daniel? Tell me more details." Her voice now carried an urgency the boy didn't expect. Daniel thought for a second and continued. "He was wearing a dark suit, looked like a rich man. He had a cold look, full of arrogance, as if he was above everyone else. As soon as he kicked me, he just kept walking as if I was nothing. He didn't care if I was hurt, he just wanted to humiliate me." Lorraine's face lost color. Her stomach churned, and her bandaged hands clutched the sheet tightly. She knew that description all too well. Every word from Daniel was a direct hit, a terrible confirmation of what she had already feared. Her gaze met the boy's, and her voice came out almost as a whisper, laden with disbelief and anger. "Daniel, that man was Ethan." The silence that followed was heavy, like thunder before the storm. Daniel felt a chill run up his spine. "Ethan? The baby's father?" he asked, blinking as if trying to put together the pieces of a puzzle that until now made no sense. "But why would he do that to me? He doesn't even know me." Lorraine closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to control the mixture of anger and indignation that was taking over her chest. "Because that's how Ethan is, Daniel. He's cruel, arrogant, and doesn't care about anyone but himself. He hurts people because he can, because he takes pleasure in humiliating others. He tried to kill his own son. Do you think he would care about hurting a street kid?" Her voice came out bitter, laden with pain and outrage. Before Daniel could respond, hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. 2 police officers appeared at the entrance of the room, their expressions serious and focused. One of them, a tall man with a stern look, held a notepad, while the other adjusted the position of the radio on his shoulder. They analyzed the scene for a moment before addressing Lorraine. "Good evening. We received a report and we need you to come with us to the station to provide clarification." Daniel looked at Lorraine, confused and worried. "A report?" he asked, his heart accelerating. "But what are you talking about?" The officer checked his notes and looked directly at Lorraine. "About the abandonment of the baby and the attempted homicide. There is sufficient evidence to open an official investigation against Ethan. We need to hear what you have to say." The shock crossed Daniel and Lorraine's faces at the same time. Ethan would finally be investigated. The man who tried to kill his own son, who destroyed lives, who humiliated so many people, would finally have to face the consequences of his actions. Lorraine felt a different adrenaline rush through her body. She knew this moment would come but didn't expect it to be so soon. "I'll go," she said, her voice firm without hesitation. "I'll tell everything I know." Daniel looked at the baby one more time, still sleeping peacefully, before getting up and following Lorraine out. The truth was about to be revealed, and Ethan, for the first time in his life, would feel the weight of justice. At the station, the atmosphere was cold and impersonal. The sound of keyboards being typed echoed through the space, mingling with the murmur of conversations between police officers and people waiting to be attended. Lorraine and Daniel were sitting across from a desk, watching the officer attending them. The man had a tired look, as if he had already heard hundreds of similar stories that day. He crossed his arms and leaned slightly forward, looking at Lorraine with an impassive expression. "So, ma'am, you're saying that Ethan Caldwell, an influential and wealthy man, abandoned his own son inside a car to die?" The officer's tone was clearly skeptical, as if the accusation was too absurd to be taken seriously. He drummed his fingers on the table, as if he was already tired before even hearing the rest of the story. "And that by some miracle the child survived." Lorraine clenched her fists on the table, feeling the indignation grow inside her. "It's not just any accusation. It's the truth," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "Ethan locked his own son inside a car, in the middle of nowhere, in the cold of the night. If it wasn't for Daniel, who heard the crying and tried to help, this child would be dead now." Her eyes flashed with anger. Her breathing was heavy and her bandaged hand trembled slightly. "He's a monster. He always has been. If you don't do anything, he'll keep hurting people." Daniel nodded vigorously beside her, still feeling the pain in his back from the kick Ethan had given him. "He's cruel. He kicked a street kid for no reason, humiliated me without even knowing me. I saw the look in his eyes. He enjoys hurting people. If he did that to me, imagine what he does to his own son." The boy felt the rage boiling inside him. He didn't want Ethan to get away with it. The officer sighed and shook his head, leaning back in his chair. "That's a very serious accusation, Mrs. Lorraine. We're talking about an influential businessman, someone with connections. I need concrete evidence before anything else." He turned to a colleague beside him, who seemed equally skeptical. "We can't just go around arresting someone like Ethan Caldwell based on allegations. We need something solid." Lorraine opened her mouth to retort, but before she could say anything, a deep, firm voice echoed through the police station lobby. "If it's evidence you need, then I have exactly what you're looking for." Everyone turned to look. An elderly gentleman wearing a dark suit and a serious expression was slowly approaching. His grey hair was neatly combed, and his eyes carried a weight of experience and wisdom. He walked with firm steps, holding a tablet in his hands, as if carrying something of utmost importance. The officer frowned. "And you are?" The man stopped in front of the table and looked directly at Lorraine, then at Daniel, and finally turned to the police officers. "My name is Richard Montgomery. I own the Montgomery supermarket chain, and by chance one of my establishments is located right next to where this baby was abandoned." He raised the tablet, pressed a few buttons on the screen, and turned the device towards the police officers. "My security cameras captured everything. From the moment Ethan Caldwell parked the car, removed the license plate so he wouldn't be identified, and left the baby strapped inside the vehicle until the moment he left, without looking back. And if that's not enough, the footage also clearly shows when a venomous spider entered the car, making the situation even worse." The police officer's eyes widened and he leaned forward, quickly grabbing the tablet. He pressed play and the recording began to play. The silence at the police station became absolute. On the screen it was possible to see Ethan getting out of a luxury car, looking around to make sure no one saw him, and then opening the rear door. The baby was there, strapped into the car seat, still moving. Ethan looked at the child for a moment and then, without any hesitation, slammed the door shut and activated the automatic locks. His expression showed no guilt, no remorse. He simply adjusted his coat, ripped off the license plate from the car, and got into another vehicle that was parked nearby, disappearing into the darkness of the early morning. The police officers watched the scene without blinking, absorbing every detail. Then, a few minutes later, another shocking scene happened. A huge spider emerged from the nearby bushes and, moving slowly, crawled towards one of the cracks in the broken window, entering the vehicle. The baby, who was still awake at that moment, began to struggle, unable to defend itself. It was clear that if no one had arrived in time, the little one would have met a tragic fate. The lead police officer paused the video and took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the screen for a few seconds. When he looked up again, his expression was no longer one of doubt. It was one of indignation. This is monstrous," he said, clenching his fists. "How can someone do this to their own child?" He turned to one of the other officers and gave a firm order. "Issue an arrest warrant immediately. I want all available vehicles after Ethan Caldwell. If he's still in town, he won't get away." Lorraine felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over her body. Finally, someone was listening. Finally, Ethan would face the consequences of what he had done. Her eyes turned to Richard Montgomery, who gave her a firm and supportive look. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked up. "If it weren't for you—" The man raised one hand, interrupting her. "I saw what this man did, and a man like him needs to pay for what he did. No one is above justice." Daniel felt a smile grow on his face. For so long he had believed that people like Ethan would always go unpunished. But now, for the first time, he felt that fate was exacting its price. The officers began to move quickly, grabbing radios and discussing the best strategy to find Ethan. Lorraine closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She wouldn't rest until she saw that man behind bars. And this time, he would have nowhere to run. The days that followed were marked by intense activity within the city. The police launched a relentless hunt for Ethan Caldwell, mobilizing all possible forces to find him. His name circulated through newspapers, television, and social media. Within a few days, the arrogant and untouchable businessman had become a wanted fugitive. His influential contacts tried to help him disappear, offered hideouts, and even attempted to bribe some officers. But this time, justice was determined not to fail. Ethan could no longer buy his freedom as he had done so many times before. His empire of power and arrogance crumbled rapidly, and the world finally saw the monster he truly was. It was on a rainy early morning that it all came to an end. Ethan was found hiding in one of his remote properties, a luxurious warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The place, which had previously served as one of his many storage facilities for smuggled goods, was now his last refuge. When the police raided the premises, he tried to resist, shouting that it was all a sham, a conspiracy to bring him down. His eyes, once full of arrogance and conceit, now revealed panic. He knew there was no way out. Ethan tried to run, tried to flee like a cornered rat, but was restrained instantly. The officers handcuffed him without hesitation, and for the first time in his life, Ethan was completely defenseless. His screams and insults were ignored. There was no one left there to obey his orders or fear his power. Ethan's trial was an event that drew the attention of the entire media. The courtroom was packed with journalists, lawyers, and onlookers who wanted to witness the downfall of the man who once considered himself untouchable. The prosecution presented irrefutable evidence. The security camera footage clearly showed Ethan abandoning his own son, his coldness when locking him in the car, and his total indifference as he left. The recording of the spider entering the vehicle was the final straw. The images left no room for excuses or lies. He tried to claim that it was all a misunderstanding, that he was the victim of a setup, but no one believed him. Every word he uttered sounded empty, a reflection of a man who never knew how to take responsibility for his actions. The sentence was harsh and deserved. The judge did not hesitate to condemn him to years in prison, ensuring that Ethan would no longer have the chance to hurt anyone. But his punishment was not just prison. His empire crumbled before his eyes. His businesses were seized, his accounts frozen, and the contracts that sustained his fortune were broken. In a matter of weeks, Ethan went from an arrogant tycoon to a penniless criminal. His assets were sold, and part of the money was allocated to social assistance funds. Another part was given to Lorraine as compensation for the suffering she endured. For the first time, fate had turned the game against him. When Lorraine received the sum intended for her, she did not feel happiness for that money. It would not buy back everything she had lost, nor erase the humiliations and suffering, but she knew exactly what to do with it. She did not want luxuries, she did not want status. All she desired was to give a dignified life to Daniel and the baby. With the conviction she had always had in protecting those she loved, she made the decision that was already pulsing in her heart, to officially adopt them. The adoption process was faster than she expected. Daniel, despite all the suffering he carried, had never had a real family. When Lorraine called him to talk about the adoption, he remained silent for a long time, absorbing those words he had never imagined hearing. His gaze shone with a mixture of surprise and restrained emotion. You want me to be your son?" he asked, almost disbelieving. His voice was trembling and his eyes welled up, but he tried to maintain his composure. "Even though I'm just a street kid?" Lorraine held the boy's face gently, her eyes full of love and conviction. "You were never just a street kid, Daniel. You've always been strong, brave, and have an enormous heart. I saw that the first day I met you. You deserve love, you deserve a home, and I want to be your mother, if you'll have me." Her words were sincere, laden with emotion. Daniel couldn't hold back his tears and threw himself into her arms, crying silently. For the first time he felt like he belonged somewhere. The baby, who had already been registered with a new name, slept peacefully in Lorraine's arms on the day the adoption papers were signed. The image was symbolic. The little one, who had once been left to die, now had a real home. He would never know the horror he had almost lived, never remember the man who had tried to take him from the world, but he would grow up surrounded by love and protection, alongside his new mother and brother Daniel. Daniel looked at the baby and smiled, tenderly caressing his little head. "Now we're a real family, aren't we?" he asked, his voice still trembling but filled with hope. Lorraine smiled, wiping away the tears that insisted on falling. "Yes, my son, and we always will be." She knew that life would still bring challenges, but she also knew that she would never face anything alone again. While Ethan rotted behind bars, deprived of all the power and money he had once flaunted, Lorraine, Daniel, and the baby were building a new beginning. They didn't have material wealth, but they had something much more valuable: love, unity, and the certainty that together they could overcome anything. Fate, which so often seemed cruel, had finally given them the true victory. And this time, nothing and no one could take it away from them. The sun shone brightly in the azure sky, spreading its golden light over the small house Lorraine had bought with part of the money received from the courts. The house was neither large nor luxurious, but it had everything they needed: a home. A spacious kitchen, where Lorraine lovingly prepared meals, a room for Daniel, another for the baby, and a large yard where they could play, run, and feel the freedom they had never had before. Every detail of that place reflected a new beginning, a fresh start filled with hope and love. Lorraine ran her hands along the porch railing and felt her heart warm. After so many difficulties, they finally had a safe place, a refuge where fear and pain no longer existed. Daniel ran through the yard, holding an old ball in his hands, laughing at the baby who tried to keep up with his wobbly steps. The little one, with his clumsy feet, stumbled on the grass and fell on his knees, but without getting hurt. He raised his shining eyes to his brother and, instead of crying, let out a hearty laugh, showing his small, uneven little teeth. Daniel laughed along with him and clapped his hands, encouraging him. "Come on, little one, try again, you can do it." The baby, waving his little arms, tried to get up, his eyes full of determination. After a few seconds of struggling against gravity, he managed to stand up again and took a few stumbling steps toward Daniel. His big brother welcomed him with open arms, scooping him up and spinning him in the air. "That's it! You did it!" he celebrated as the little one laughed with joy. Sitting on the porch, Lorraine watched the scene with an emotional smile. Every laugh, every game between the two was proof that they had made the right choice, that they were on the right path. Daniel was no longer the scared and starving street kid she had met long ago. He had color in his face, a sparkle in his eyes, and a confidence that hadn't existed before. The fear of being abandoned again had disappeared, replaced by the certainty that, for the first time, he belonged somewhere. He no longer had to worry about where he would sleep or when he would eat again. He had a home, a mother, and a little brother who adored him. She got up and walked over to the two of them, taking the baby in her arms and kissing his forehead tenderly. "My little one is growing up too fast," she joked, gently rocking him as he snuggled against her chest. Daniel laughed and crossed his arms, feigning concern. "Yes, soon he'll be running faster than me and giving me a hard time." Lorraine smiled, running her hand through the older one's hair, and looked at the two of them with tenderness. "No matter how much he grows, he'll always have us to take care of him. We're a family now. Nothing can change that." Daniel nodded, and at that moment he felt more loved and protected than ever before. The days passed and Daniel started attending school. At first, he felt afraid, thinking he would never be able to keep up with the other children. He couldn't read properly, didn't know the rules, and feared being laughed at. But Lorraine was there, encouraging him every step of the way, helping him with his lessons, showing him that he was capable. And little by little, Daniel began to stand out. He discovered that he enjoyed learning, that he was curious about the world, that his mind was as sharp as his courage. One day he came home holding a report card and handed it to Lorraine without saying a word. She looked at the paper and her eyes widened. "Look who got the highest grade in the class," she said, and Daniel smiled shyly, embarrassed but visibly happy. "It was just luck," he mumbled, but deep down he felt proud of himself. For the first time, he believed he had a future. The baby was also growing up surrounded by love and affection, enveloped by an environment of protection and affection that would never be lacking. Each new step he took was greeted with applause and radiant smiles. Each babbled word became an event worthy of celebration, as if it were the most beautiful melody ever heard. He was the center of attention for Lorraine and Daniel, who saw in him a symbol of hope, of a fresh start without suffering. Unlike his older brother, he would never have to face the cold of the streets, never know the anguish of hunger nor the cruelty of rejection. He would have a secure childhood, filled with joy, surrounded by the love of a mother who would always be there to protect him, and a brother who would teach him to be strong, to never bow his head in the face of life's challenges. Lorraine, always attentive to every detail, observed the two boys with tenderness, her heart overflowing with gratitude. Often she would remain silent, simply admiring the scene of the two playing in the yard, seeing Daniel running after the little one, holding him in his arms and spinning him in the air, while childish laughter echoed through the space. At night, when she put the two to bed, she would linger a few more minutes just watching the peaceful faces of the children, listening to their light breathing, as if she wanted to eternalize those moments. Sometimes she would cry softly, not out of sadness but happiness. She never imagined her life would take that turn, that she would have the opportunity to build a family, to love and be loved in such a pure and true way. One afternoon, while sweeping the house and listening to the sound of the wind swaying the trees outside, Lorraine heard Daniel calling her from the living room. But this time, his voice sounded different. There was something special in the way he called her. "Mom," he said firmly and without hesitation. She stopped immediately, feeling a shiver run through her body. Since Daniel had come to live with her, he had never said that word. She turned slowly, surprised and emotional, finding the boy's brown eyes fixed on her, filled with an intense glow. "What is it, son?" she asked, feeling a different warmth in her chest, a mixture of joy and anticipation. Daniel took a deep breath, as if he were gathering courage to say something he had been keeping inside for a long time. His lips curved into a small smile, and he finally let out the words he had felt for so long. "Thank you for everything," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I never thought I could have a real family. I never thought anyone could love me like that. But you showed me I was wrong." His eyes welled up, and his breathing became ragged. He wasn't used to expressing his feelings, but at that moment he felt he needed to say that. Lorraine felt her eyes burn with tears about to fall. She dropped the broom without thinking twice and walked over to Daniel, pulling him into a tight hug. She felt the boy's body relax against hers, as if he were finally finding the comfort and security he had always sought. "My son, you have always been loved. You have always been special. And nothing in the world will ever change that," she whispered, holding him tightly. Daniel closed his eyes and allowed himself to feel that love, that unconditional affection he had never had before. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of the future. He knew that no matter what happened, he would have Lorraine and the little one by his side. The years passed, and life went on in a light and peaceful way. Daniel grew up, becoming a strong, determined young man full of dreams. The baby, who was now a smart and energetic little boy, ran through the yard as if he owned the world, making up stories and creating magical worlds in his imagination. Lorraine continued to be the pillar of that family, caring for them with all the love in her heart, teaching them the values they would carry forever. Time did not erase the scars of the past, but turned them into marks of resilience, reminders that they were stronger than the pain. On a special birthday, Daniel decided to prepare a surprise for Lorraine. He spent months saving money from small jobs he did after school, carefully saving every coin. On the exact day, he appeared with a simple cake and a present wrapped in colored paper, his shy but affectionate smile. "Mom, this is for you," he said, handing her the package with a special glow in his eyes. Lorraine frowned, surprised, but took the present gently, opening it slowly. Inside the box was a photo frame with a picture of the three of them together, taken in the garden of the house. On the frame, Daniel had written in neat letters, "Our family, forever." Lorraine was speechless. She felt her heart overflow with love, and tears began to stream down her face. This was not just a photo, it was proof that they had made it, that they had overcome the past and built a present filled with love and hope. She hugged Daniel and the little one at the same time, feeling the warmth of those who were now her real family. "This is the best present I've ever received," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Because you are the best gift life could have given me." Daniel smiled and tightened the hug, feeling that he finally belonged where he had always belonged. The little one laughed between their arms, not fully understanding the moment, but feeling the love and security around him. The sun slowly began to set, tinting the sky orange, gold, and soft shades of pink. A gentle breeze swayed the trees around the house, carrying the scent of garden flowers, while joyful and genuine laughter echoed through the yard. The suffering, the pains of the past, all the darkness that had once enveloped them, all that was left behind, buried in time. What remained now was a future full of possibilities, full of hope and love, a path of happiness they had built together with effort and courage. They didn't need luxury, they didn't need wealth or recognition from the world. They had something much more valuable, something no amount of money could buy. They had each other, they had a home, they had unconditional love, and that was all that mattered, today and forever. If Lorraine and Daniel's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and check out the story that is appearing on the screen now, specially chosen for you. See you soon.